Hey, everybody, I hope you are doing well. We are in Genesis 48, only three more chapters to go 48, 49, 50. We will be done all the way through Genesis this year. Wild to think about, but really thankful for it. We see in Genesis 48, Jacob is blessing the two sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. These are the two sons that Joseph had while he has been in Egypt. And this transfer of blessing really is massive. But there are a couple of things in this culture. Transfer of blessing is a big deal, right? But there are a couple of things that make this one a little different than some of the other ones that I think it's important that we address. First of all, in verse 5, he says, your two sons born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are now mine. So he is now, not only he's not blessing them as his grandsons, he's saying, hey, they're my sons. They're going to be a part of the 12 tribes eventually that I lead. That's the blessing. And so, and then he says, just like Reuben and Simeon do. Basically, what he's doing is replacing Reuben and Simeon in some ways with Ephraim and Manasseh because of all of the wicked actions of Reuben and Simeon. They're going to be consequences that lead to them, or their actions are going to make them experience consequences down the road. And so now he's taking Joseph's two sons and making them a part of his blessing and the inheritance that he's passing down. So that's the first thing that makes this a little bit differently, because he's not blessing them as grandkids, but as like they're his own kids. And then it says, but Israel stretched out his right hand and put it on the head of Ephraim, the younger, and crossing his hands, he put his left on Manasseh's head, although Manasseh was the firstborn. So the other thing that makes this a little weird is that he is blessing them different than what the traditional way would have been. Right? The traditional way would have been the firstborn, the older one, gets the more significant blessing. The younger one still gets blessed, but gets a little bit less than the firstborn. And so this has become a theme in this family where the older ends up serving the younger, which again could point us to Jesus, right? Those who are last will be first; those who are first will be last. But not only that. Right? It just shows us that God's ways are different than man's ways, that God's ways are higher than man's ways, right? As a matter of fact, after this happens, Joseph thought that it was a mistake, it says, and so he takes his father's hand to move it, right? To move it from Ephraim's head to put it on Manasseh's head, and he said, hey, not that way. I know you can't see. This one's the firstborn, and he said, listen, I know. Right, I know he's going to become a tribe too. He's going to be great too. But his younger brother is going to be greater than he, and his offspring will become a populous nation. In other words, it's almost like it says that Jacob was struggling with his eyesight. It's almost like the hand of God is guiding his hands to do what he wants, right? Because God's ways are different than ours. Because if this was the way of man, if this was the traditional way, he would have put his right hand on the firstborn and his left hand on the younger one. But he doesn't do that, and it's like, God is we've talked about God guiding and directing things behind the scenes, God's sovereignty and providence. We see that coming to fruition here, that God has given him insight, that God is guiding his hands to the right place. And it's not the traditional method. It's not man's ways. It's about God's ways. And we have to understand that God's ways can be different and God's ways are higher than ours. Not only that, in the middle of this blessing, right, he's talking about, as he's blessing Joseph, before he blesses his two sons, he tells us a couple things about God that I just think are really beautiful. I mean, you know the story of Jacob. Jacob, we've talked about it, right? But Jacob had some significant things happen. I mean, this is a crazy story. He's been everywhere. And one of the things he says is that the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. So he's saying that God has been my shepherd my entire life, during the good and during the bad. During when I was struggling and when I wasn't struggling, during when I was wrestling with God and when I wasn't wrestling with God, God has always been my shepherd. And we need to understand that if we have placed our faith in Christ, that's true of us. Sometimes we might not feel his presence. Sometimes we might not feel like he's there. Sometimes circumstances might be bad. But God, if you've placed your faith in Jesus, is your shepherd and is walking with you, guiding you, directing you, protecting you, taking care of you, throughout every day of your life. And that's such good news for us today. Not only that, he says, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm. So he sees that God has not only shepherded him, but God has redeemed him. And the same, if we've placed our faith in Christ, God has redeemed us as well. And that is good news for us today. The last thing I want to mention is that at the very end, he's again talking to Joseph, and he says, look, I'm about to die, but God's going to be with you. In other words, God's going to make everything okay. And God's going to bring you back to the land of your fathers. In other words, God's going to fulfill the promise that he made. And then he says, over above what I'm giving your brothers, I'm giving you the one mountain slope that I took for the Amorites with my sword and bow. In other words, he's given Joseph clan leadership over everything. Again, non-traditional. Joseph's younger than the rest, right? Non-traditional, not man's ways. But again, God's ways are bigger and higher. But not only that, God made some promises. And even though their circumstances in the moment, they're in Egypt, not in the promised land. Even though their circumstances in the moment don't dictate that God's promise is going to be fulfilled and come to fruition, he has to learn. Jacob wants to teach Joseph. Israel wants to teach Joseph to learn that hope comes from trusting the promise. And the reason we can trust the promise is because we can trust the one who has made the promise. And so even when our circumstances don't align with it, we can trust God's promises are true because we know the character of God and how kind and full of grace and love and mercy and unchanging he is. And so even though our circumstances might make us want to doubt the promises of God, we need to be a people who have hope and trust the promises of God, even when our circumstances don't dictate it. And that's where hope and joy and peace will come from, is us trusting in those promises, even when our circumstances don't dictate it, because we trust in the one who has made the promise. God is a promise maker and a promise keeper. So let's trust in him and let's trust in his promises. And as we do that, we will experience hope and joy and peace during this season, no matter what our circumstances are. I love you guys. We'll see you next week for Genesis 49.